Cool.
Hey, this is Xander Cesari with the Rust Project content team, recording on the last hour of the last day of RustConf 2025 here in Seattle. So it's been a long and amazing 2 days. And I'm sitting down here with a team member from the Rust infra project, the unsung heroes of the Rust language. Want to intro yourself and kind of how you got involved?
Yeah, sure. I'm JD. Jan David is the full name, but especially in international context, just go with JD.
JD.
I've been working for the Rust Foundation for the past 3 years as a full-time employee, and I essentially got the jackpot to work full-time on open source.
Awesome.
And yeah, I've been in the infra team of the Rust project for the whole time, and then for the past 2 years, I've led the team together with Jake.
Awesome. So the infra team, this is the thing that makes Rust happen. So there's a lot of different pieces in that. Can you kind of give me an overview of what is the responsibility of the infra team?
Sure. I think on a high level, we think about this in terms of like we serve like two different groups of people. On one side, we have users of the language, and on the other side, we really try to like provide good tooling for the maintainers of the language.
Okay.
And maybe starting with the maintainer side, this is really like everything about like how Rust is built. From like the moment someone makes a contribution or like opens a PR, we maintain the continuous integration that makes sure that the PR actually works. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of like bots and tooling helping out behind the scenes to kind of maintain a good status quo, like a sane state. Lots of like small things like triage tools on GitHub to like set labels and ping people and these kind of things. And that's kind of managed by the infra team at large. And then on the user side, we have a lot of like the two most important things are making sure users can actually download Rust. We don't develop crates.io, but like we support the infrastructure to actually like ship crates to users. Like all the downloads go through content delivery networks that we provide. The same for Rust releases. So if I don't do my job well, which has happened, there might be a global outage of like crates.io and no one can download stuff. But those are kind of the two different buckets of services that we run and operate.
Gotcha. So on the maintainer side, so the Rust organization on GitHub, large organization, a lot of activity, a lot of code. And there's obviously a lot of big code bases being developed on GitHub, but there are not that many languages the size of Rust being developed on GitHub. Are there unique challenges to developing a language and the tooling that's required versus developing other software projects?
I can think of a few things that have less to do, I think, with like the language specifically, but with some of the architecture decisions that were made very early on in like the life cycle of Rust.
Sure.
So one of the things that actually caused a lot of headache for mostly GitHub, and then when they complained to us, for us as well, is like for a long time, the index for crates.io was a Git repo on GitHub. And as Rust started to grow, the activity on that repo became so big that it actually caused like some issues, I would say, to like say friendly on like the GitHub side, just in terms of like how much resources that single repository was consuming.
Yeah.
Which also then kind of started this whole the work on like a web-based HTTP-based index to kind of shift that away. And that's certainly like one area where we've seen how like Rust has definitely like struggled a little bit with like the platform, but also the platform providers struggled with us.
Yeah.
And then I think for Rust itself, like especially when we look at CI, we really want to make sure that like Rust works well on all of the targets and all the platforms we support. And that means that we have a like extremely wide CI pipeline where for every tier 1 target, we want to run all the tests. We want to build the release artifacts. We want to upload all of that to S3. We want to do as much as we reasonably can for like tier 2 targets, and to a lesser extent, maybe even test like some stuff on tier 3. And that just increased, like, it's a gigantic like build pipeline. Marco gave a talk today on like what we've done with CI over the last year. And one of the numbers that came out of like doing the research for this talk is that we accumulate like over 3 million build minutes per month, which is like 6 years of like CPU time essentially every month. And I think especially when it comes to like open source projects, I think we're one of the like biggest consumers of like GitHub Actions in that sense. Not the biggest in total, like they're definitely like bigger commercial projects, but that's something that I think is a unique challenge for us to kind of manage, because we want to be able to like do as much, provide as best, like as good of a service as we can to the community and make sure that what we ship is high quality. But yeah, that comes at a huge cost in terms of like scaling. And as Rust gets more popular and like we want to target more and more platforms, this is like a problem that just continues to grow. Like we'll probably never remove a lot of targets. So this is an interesting kind of challenge to think about of like if it's already big now, how does this look in like 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and like how can we kind of make sure we actually can maintain the level of quality we want to ship.
So when you build and run for a target in the CI pipeline, some of those tier 1 targets you can just ask a cloud service provider to give you a VM running on that piece of hardware, but some of them are probably not things that you can just run in the cloud. Is there some Hill Lab somewhere, or?
So you're touching on a conversation, or like a discussion that's literally happening like pretty much as we speak. So far, we essentially, as part of like our target tier policy, there is a clause in there that says like it needs to be able to run in CI.
Yeah.
And that has also meant like we've kind of been very selective about only promoting things to tier 1 that we can actually run and test.
Right.
And for all of this, we did have it runs on GitHub Actions essentially. Like so far, we used very little hardware that is not like natively provided by GitHub. And this is exactly the point with like Rust increasing popularity. We just got like requests to support IBM platforms and RISC-V, and those are not natively supported on GitHub. And this has kicked off an internal conversation about like how do we even support this? Like how can we as a project essentially enable, in this case, for example, companies to like provide us hardware to test on? But what are the implications of this? Because on one side, there's a lot of like interesting constraints that come with this, or like considerations that we need to things that we need to take into consideration. Where, for example, like you don't want your PRs to randomly fail because someone else's hardware is not available.
Right.
Like we're already so resource constrained on on how many PRs we can merge each day, that adding noise to that process would be really slow down like the contribution rate to Rust, for example. On the other end, there's also like security implications, especially if we talk about promoting something to tier 1 and we want to build release artifacts on that hardware. We need to make sure that those are actually like secure and no one like sneaks a backdoor into the Rust compiler for like RISC-V or so.
Yeah.
So there are interesting challenges for us, especially like in the world we live in where supply chain security is a massive concern about how can we both support the growth of Rust and the growth of the language or the community, the ecosystem at large, while also making sure that like the things we ship are reliable, secure, and performant. And that is becoming an increasingly more, I think, like relevant and interesting piece to work on, because so far we've gotten away with like the platforms that GitHub supports, but it's really cool to see that like this is starting to change and people approach us and are really willing to like provide hardware, provide sponsorship, all of those things to like help us test on their platforms essentially. But we don't have a good answer for this yet. It's something we're still trying to figure out, like what does this mean and like what do we need to take into consideration. What are our requirements to like use external hardware essentially.
Yeah, everyone is so excited about Rust will run everywhere, but there's a maintenance cost there that is almost exponential in scope.
It's really interesting as well because like there's an interesting tension there to a certain degree, and I think with IBM, for example, like approaching this, it's an interesting example, guys. Who has IBM platforms at home? Like the amount of users for that platform is like really, really small globally. But they're also a company that is really like invests heavily in Rust and like tries to like make this happen and is willing to provide the hardware. And then for us, it becomes also an interesting question of like, is there a line? Is there like a certain like requirement? Is there a certain like amount of usage that a platform would need for us to like promote this? Or do we say, hey, we do actually want to promote as much as we can to tier 1? And I think this is also a conversation that we didn't really have to have yet. Like this is something that's only now kind of starting to creep in as Rust is being adopted, as companies are pouring serious like money and resources into it. And that's exciting to see. But it's also one of those things where I noticed that like in this specific case, for example, like companies approach the infra team to figure out how we can add this to CI as like a first step to figure out tier 1 support. But it's also a broader discussion that we need to have with like more like larger parts of the projects, like for tier 1 promotions, for example, like compiler team needs to sign off, infra needs to sign off. there are much more people that need to be involved in this discussion of like, yeah, how do we actually how can we support the growing needs, I think, of like the ecosystem at large.
Yeah. I get the feeling that's going to be a theme throughout this interview of
100%.
the growth. Yeah. So one other tool that's part of this pipeline that I totally didn't know about for a long time, and I think a talk at a different conference clued me into it, is Crater, which is a tool that attempts to run all of the Rust code it can find anywhere in the world on the internet. Can you talk about that tool and what that does and how that integrates into the release process?
So whenever someone creates a pull request on GitHub to essentially add a new feature or a bug fix to the Rust compiler, they have the ability to start what's called a Crater run, or essentially like an experiment. And then Crater is pretty much like it's a pretty like large fleet of machines that will try to pull in as many crates as they can. Ideally, we would love to test on all of the crates. For some reason, like for a variety of reasons, that's not possible. Like there are crates on crates.io that don't actually build always. So we have like lists to kind of reduce that.
Right.
And I think right now, from the top of my head, I want to say we test against like roughly 60% or so of crates. But this experiment essentially takes the code from your pull request, builds the Rust compiler with it, and then uses that to build all of these crates, and reports back whether or not there are any regressions in the feature that you proposed. And I think that's a very important feature for us to like maintain backwards compatibility with new versions and new features in Rust, because we have this tool to say, cool, does the ecosystem actually still compile if we add this new feature to the compiler? Where do we run into issues? And then, and this is done more on like the compiler team side, I think, there's a decision to be made about like, how do we then proceed? Like, is this something that is acceptable? Is this something where we want to like help the ecosystem evolve?
Yeah.
But having the tool itself is what enables kind of this conversation to have, because you get insight into, hey, what impact does this change actually have on the wider ecosystem?
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, because as more and more companies adopt Rust, they're talking about, well, is this language going to be stable? Is this language going to be backward compatible? You hear about other programming languages that maybe had a big version change that caused a lot of drama and code changes. And the fact that if you have code on crates.io, the compiler team is probably already testing against it for backwards compatibility.
Yeah, the chances are high, I would say. And I think, especially like looking at the whole like Python 2 to Python 3 migration, I think as an industry, we've learned a lot of like lessons from these like big version jumps. And I think that has, and I can't really speak to this because I'm not a member of the compiler team and I wasn't involved in like the decision-making processes. But I feel like this is one of the things why Rust is like so, why backwards compatibility is like such a big thing in like Rust's design.
Yeah.
To kind of make it as painless as possible to kind of stay current, stay up to date, kind of make sure that, we don't accidentally break the language or create like these really painful like migration points that would require a lot of the ecosystem to kind of move with us.
Yeah. Do you know are there other organizations who are pulling like Crater, for example, and running it on like their own internal crate repository, like maybe like some of like the big FANG companies or maybe other compiler developers or even other languages? Or is this all really just bespoke for the Rust C team?
I don't know anyone who really like runs Crater itself as a tool. Crater is built on essentially like a level of like a sandboxing framework that is more like shared more widely with other tools that we run as well. Like DocsRS, for example, uses some of the underlying like infrastructure to build all of the documentation as well. So we're trying to like share as much as we can from the functionality that is in Crater. But I'm not aware of anyone who would actually like do the same or like use it in the same way that we do.
Gotcha. And so the other big part of your job, you said the infra team works on supporting the maintainers, but they also work on supporting the users and consumers of Rust and pulling from crates.io. And so, it sounds like crates.io is not something within your team specifically, but a lot of maybe the backend support there.
Yeah, exactly. So crates.io has its own team, and that team maintains the web application and the APIs of crates.io. But then kind of the crates themselves, all of the like individual files that people download, they are hosted within our infrastructure, and the infrastructure team maintains the content delivery network that sits in front of that. So every download of a crate goes through infrastructure that we maintain, And then we collaborate very closely with the Crates.io team on kind of this shared interface. So they kind of own the app and the API, and then we help out with actually making sure that files get delivered to the end user.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's probably a lot of verification of the files get uploaded, and you do some kind of checking every time someone is pushing a version into Crates.io.
That part all happens within like Crates.io as an application.
Okay.
So Cargo will like use the API of Crates.io to like upload the crate file, and then Crates.io has a ton of like internal logic to verify that it's valid and it works, and I don't know. Lots of things that, again, for us as an infrastructure team, we treat this as a black box where
Right.
Crates.io does something. And then if Crates.io is happy with it, it will upload the file to S3, put it in a bucket, and from that point onwards, kind of infrastructure makes sure that that file is accessible, it can be downloaded, and yeah, people can actually start using your crate.
So I guess in this theme of Rust somewhat being the victim of its own success, I assume all of these traffic graphs and download graphs are very much up and to the right.
We have on the foundation side, we have an internal, like one of our colleagues loves every so often to check how long it takes for 1 billion downloads to happen on Crates.io.
Okay.
And that number has been falling so quickly.
Wow.
It would have been nice to check beforehand, to be honest. I don't remember what it was 3 years ago, but it has come down by orders of magnitude.
Okay.
And in our download traffic, we definitely see an exponential growth where our traffic tends to double year over year.
Wow.
And that is pretty much sustained. So it really seems like Rust is getting a lot of adoption in the ecosystem, and people are using it for more and more things, really.
Yeah. And I mean, how is the infra team kind of scaled with this? Are you staying ahead of it? There are a lot of late nights and
There have been. So in the 3 years that I've been working in the infra team, I feel like every year there's like another theme, which is essentially a fire to put out.
yeah.
And it changes because we fix one thing and then like the next thing breaks. And so far, luckily, those have been like sequential. They have not been parallel. So when I joined, we were really like bandwidth was like the big topic, while over the last year it was more CI. But especially like 3 years ago, we're really like getting into this inflection point where we were seeing like the doubling of the traffic, and our capacity for the sponsorship that we had at the time was kind of we're hitting the limits essentially of that. And then 3 years ago, Fastly welcomed us into their Fast Forward program, and has been sponsoring all of our bandwidth since then.
Wow.
So that has helped mostly me actually like sleep at night, because it's been a super good relationship that we have with them. It's been an awesome partnership. They've been helping us at every step of the way to kind of remove this like fear of like we might run into limits, it might not be enough. And they've been super active in like the open source community at large. Most famously, like they also sponsor PyPy and like the Python ecosystem, compared to which we're like a tiny fish in a very big pond. So that gives us a lot of confidence that like we can actually like sustain this growth and essentially keep providing crates and releases with the quality that people have come to like know in the future as well.
Yeah, in some ways, Rust did such a good job of making all of that infrastructure feel so invisible when you just type cargo commands into your terminal that, it feels magical.
And I'm really happy about this. So, and this is an interesting thing with like running an infrastructure team in open source, because most of our infrastructure, especially if you look at like the 10-year history since like the last stable release, but let's say like the 15 years since like Rust really started, I've been here for 3 years, and I've been the first full-time employed infrastructure engineer. So for, let's say, like 10 to 12 years, infrastructure was run by volunteers. And for them, it was really important that stuff just works, because you can't really page volunteers in the middle of the night because like your server caught fire or because like the downloads don't work anymore. So from the beginning of the infrastructure team, a lot of our infrastructure has been really focused to be essentially like as simple as possible, to be as reliable as possible. And similarly with like the CDNs that we use, I always feel really bad because like Fastly is an amazing sponsor for us. And every time we meet them at conferences or they have new features, they ask us if we want to use them, if we want to talk about how we're using Fastly in production. And every time they ask us, I'm like, listen guys, like we have the simplest configuration possible. Like we set some HTTP headers in our CDN. That's pretty much it.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing else exciting happening. Like it's a cool platform, but like we're using the smallest set of features because we want to make sure that we can actually maintain this with a super small team that's mostly volunteer based. And there has been really like a strong kind of, it's always been like our priority to make sure that like we keep things simple, we keep them reliable. We don't use all of the like the fanciest, like coolest new technology, just to make sure that like as an open source project, we keep it sustainable.
Yeah. Now, volunteer-based organizations seem to have to care about work-life balance, which is probably terrific, and there's lessons to be learned there.
It's an interesting, it's definitely a very interesting environment to work in, I have to say. Like, it definitely has other rules than corporations or like commercial, teams.
Yeah.
We definitely need to think about kind of the amount of work that we can do in a given time frame in a much different way, because it's also unpredictable when someone has time, when they're around, what happens in their own life. So for a lot of kind of the work that we've done over the last few years, we've been really trying to kind of essentially reduce the amount of fires that could break out. And then when they break out, try to like shield the volunteers from them a little bit and like take that work on as full-time employees. And that started with me 3 years ago. Last year, Marco joined to kind of increase kind of the capacity that we have. Because like there's so much to do on the infra side that even with me working full time, we were just not enough people to do it.
So you're 2 full-time and everything else is volunteer.
Exactly. Like the team right now is around 8 people, and then it's Marco and me who work full time. We're paid by the Rust Foundation to focus exclusively on the infrastructure.
Yeah.
And then we have a handful of volunteers who work on like different things. The infra team, because like our field of responsibility is so wide, we work, I think, more in like silos than like other teams might do, where we have people who are care a lot about like very specific parts of the infrastructure. Because I think otherwise there's too much to do to kind of hold everything in your head and like know everything. So it's been a really nice mix, I think, and it's been amazing to work with the people on the team. And I think as someone who is kind of privileged enough to like work full time on this, who has the time, has the resources, we've really tried to find a way how I think we can take some of like bear the bigger burden, I want to say, and like try to create a space that is where it's like, I would say like fun for volunteers to come in and like do the exciting work, do the things where there's less risk of like something catching fire, where it's easier to kind of come in, do something, and then also know that like it's okay if your personal life takes over for the next 2 weeks, because someone is there to kind of make sure the server and the lights stay on, but also because like it's like a lower risk area, and this is really where like this is really the more on the maintainer side, where we have like all of the GitHub apps and the bots that help with triage. Like there, it's less risky if something goes wrong, while on the user side, like again, if you push the wrong DNS setting, as someone might have done, then you have the situation for 30 minutes no one can like download crates.
Oof.
And this is then, no one in this case means like globally not a single user, which that's not necessarily an experience I want volunteers to have. Like that is super stressful, and ultimately like the reason why I joined in the first place, because like there was this feeling of burnout, because like it is a lot of responsibility to bear, and it's easier to do this as a full-timer. We have so much more time and also ways to kind of manage that, that it's, I'm extremely amazed by what the infra team has been able to do just as volunteers. It's unbelievable kind of what they've built and like how far they pushed Rust to get to the point where we are now.
Yeah, and I think anyone who's managing web traffic in this year, 2025, is talking about web traffic skyrocketing due to bots and scrapers for, I guess, AI or other purposes. Has that hit the Rust network as well?
Yeah, we've definitely seen this. This is again, like it's a different team, but we've seen this on the DocsRS side in particular, that DocsRS just has been hit by crawlers once in a while, and it has caused some serious like service deterioration on our side. So we're painfully aware of kind of an increase in traffic that oftentimes then comes on like very like short and like but very intense bursts where crawlers just go wild. And it definitely introduces a new challenge to our infrastructure, where we need to figure out how we react to this and how we can protect kind of our services from, essentially like becoming unavailable to like actual users of the language who want to use docs.rs in that moment to look up something that's relevant for their work. I think especially like on the web scraping side, this has definitely been an behavior that we've observed. And then on the other side, where it's a little bit more about like our CDNs can handle the traffic in most cases. Like it's really more the application side where this is an issue. On the CDN side, we see people just like crawling, for example, like crates.io to like, I can only assume like vacuum up all of crates into like an LLM.
Yeah.
And luckily for us, we've done a lot of work over the last 2 years, I think, to make sure that like crates.io as an application is not impacted as much by these traffic spikes.
Mm-hmm.
So downloads, for example, bypass crates.io fully now and go like straight to the CDN.
Yeah.
So the API is never hit by kind of these bursts and these, what in the past would have become it would have looked like a DDoS attack ultimately, because we got so many requests from so many like sources that we couldn't really handle this. So we've done a lot of work on the back end to kind of try to ensure that like our stack is essentially reliable, but it's certainly something that over the last year has changed the game. It can definitely, it's noticeable for us as well in the work that we do that like, certainly crawlers are much more active than they were before.
Yeah, no, that's right. And I'm sure Fastly is working on this as well. I mean, their business has got to have to be adapting to be robust to this new internet.
Yeah, this is, for example, like one of the conversations that is also happening right now. docs.rs is still hosted on AWS. We had CloudFront, but we are talking about trying out like putting this behind Fastly, for example, because we do have through Fastly we get a lot of features for free. For example, like their bot protection to kind of keep out those crawlers. But this is really, again, this is something where our conversations have changed in the last 6 months or so. Where when the year started, I did not think that this would be the topic that we would be discussing today, because like it was just not a topic.
Yeah.
We were talking about other things. For docs.rs, we also have a lot of plans of like how to rebuild the infrastructure that powers docs.rs. That's been an ongoing project, and I thought we would focus on that and do that work instead. But with kind of the changes in the industry and suddenly like everyone, trying to accumulate as much knowledge as possible, we also noticed that our priorities have changed, and the problems that we face have definitely like the priorities have shifted a little bit.
Yeah, and I assume as one of the few paid members of a mostly volunteer team, you often wind up working on the fires, not the maybe interesting next feature that is more fun to work on.
That is true. Although it sounds a little bit negative if you say, "Oh, I only get to work on the fires, I don't get to work on interesting things." Sometimes it can feel like this because there is a lot of, I think with any like technology that you maintain, with any servers, anything really that is code, there is a maintenance overhead to this, or there's a maintenance burden, and we certainly pay that price on the infrastructure side as well. So Marco, for example, spent some time this year going through like all of the servers that we run, cataloging them, making sure that they're patched, that they're on the latest operating system version. We updated our Ubuntu to the latest LTS. And this is it feels a little bit like busy work where you just have to like do it because it's highly relevant and necessary, but that is not work that is like super exciting.
Yeah.
But then especially when it comes to, for example, like what we talked about with the CDN and like figuring out, hey, how does the spot protection feature work? Would it actually be relevant? That's actually also really cool for us to work on, because it allows us to play with like some nice toys that like vendors provide to us. But it's also, you're working really on like the cutting edge in a way where the challenges that we try to address, there are challenges that like the industry or like the internet at large is facing. So how do you deal with this traffic in a good way? What are the implications of like banning bots, for example? Like how big is the error rate of this? Like how likely is it that you would ban like actual users who, and we have this sometimes that someone like actually just makes an honest mistake where like it looks like they're like crawling our website, but they might have just misconfigured like their curl script or something. So it's an interesting field to work in as well, just to figure out like how can we use some new features, how can we address these new challenges that are popping up. And that makes it really kind of also for us as like full-timers who do more of like the boring work maybe. It still keeps it super interesting to kind of work in this team, work in this field, and really kind of go along with kind of how the world is changing around us, because it's, if there's one constant that's changed, that's what we've learned, I think.
Well, another ripped from the headlines change in the world that's happened recently around this topic is software supply chain security, and specifically XZUtils and the conversation around open source security. I mean, how much has that changed the landscape you work in?
Oh, I have to say, like the XZUtils compromise, that was scary. That was a little bit of like, I don't want to say a wake-up call. Like, we've been aware that like supply chain security is a thing. It's not the first compromise that has happened, but specifically with this one, the way it happened was, like, for me, it felt scary, because you really noticed that there was an actor who spent a year and a half building social trust in an open source project to then do a compromise.
Yeah.
And thinking about this in the context of Rust, for example, like Rust as a project, I think every team is talking about how we need more maintainers, how there's too much workload on the people who are currently contributing, how the growth of Rust puts strain on kind of the organization as a whole. Which also means like we want to be an open and welcoming project anyways, but it also right now there is a need to bring new people in. So if someone comes along and says, hey, I'm willing to help out here, please help me on board. And then he sticks around for a year, or like they stick around for a year and then suddenly like do something malicious, I think we would be really susceptible to this as well. I don't think that we as a project, or I think open source in general, I think for this kind of attack vector, I think this is inherently a problem in open source.
Yeah, it's antithetical to the culture.
Exactly. And thinking about this and trying to figure out like how do we kind of as a project, as an organization, as an ecosystem, how do we try to deal with this, with these like persistent threat actors who have the time to kind of essentially pay someone a year to like work on open source. That's an interesting problem that very much like changes the tone of the conversation, where, and I've joked about this in the past a little bit, where like there was a time where like I felt like the biggest threat to like Crates.io was like me accidentally like pulling the plug on like a CDN or so. But I think this has changed. And I think the biggest threat to our infrastructure right now is not so much me like causing a global outage because I delete something. I think it's really the risk of someone actually like putting malicious code into our releases, into our supply chain, into Crates.io, finding ways to kind of mess with our system in ways that we're honestly are not prepared for, like where we as a volunteer-run organization might be too slow to react to change that happen in the industry, where some new sophisticated attack comes along and like we might not pick it up immediately. We might not realize that like we are vulnerable to this. And especially like thinking back over like the last 3 years, I think this is something where to me felt really noticeable around like maybe after like the first year or so, where I felt like, oh, with kind of this inflection point where we see like traffic doubling, we see the usage of Rust go up so much. We heard all the news like around 2 years ago, like everyone was like coming out with news about like how Rust is used in the Windows kernel now, how it's part of Android, how iOS has like some stuff written in it. So suddenly we're in a situation where Rust is everywhere. And if you want to have an attack everywhere, like why not put it in Rust then?
It puts a big target on your back, right?
It has definitely changed the game.
Yeah.
And in a way, I'm really happy because like on the Rust Foundation has a security working for the foundation who has done a lot of like the threat modeling behind this and has worked very actively with us on some of the infrastructure security. I know that there's a lot of work going into like specifically like the Crates ecosystem and how to prevent supply chain security or like supply chain attacks through Crates. The Crates.io ecosystem. So luckily this is not a problem that like we on the infra side need to solve ourselves or like solve independently, but it's definitely something that has gotten a lot more attention. And honestly, I think this will be one of the big challenges for the future, is really trying to figure out how we as like a mostly like volunteer-run project, as an organization, how we can keep up with kind of this looming threat, I think, in the industry at large.
Well, and it is the industry at large. I mean, this is not a unique problem to the Rust package manager. This has to be shared by all packaged registries, from the Python world to the JavaScript world to maybe even Nix, right? So is there kind of an industry-wide conversation about how to build how to help each other out and share some learnings?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot happening. I have to smile a little bit because we do often like with a lot of empathy, but also a little bit of like a feeling of relief, share news when some other package system gets compromised because we're like, oh, it's not just us.
Not us, yeah.
This time it's NPM. But we share these very actively. So we really try to stay aware of like what's happening in the industry as well, what's happening in other ecosystems, what new threats or like attack vectors are emerging, what are other ecosystems struggling with, and this could be security, but sometimes also just purely usability. NPM, like I think this like a year and a half or so ago, had like the everything package where someone like just had every package on NPM as a dependencies to theirs, and it like blew up the package index. So this is, for example, also something like we take in and figure out like, is this something that like Crates.io would struggle with as well? Like, do we need to make changes? And similarly on the security side, we really try to like follow along with what's happening. And then especially in the packaging community, so the different package managers, I've also seen more of a movement start there to like actually come together and figure out how, like first of all, what are the problems that everyone shares? There's a little bit of like a joke, I think, that we all treat this as like we're all just shipping files over the internet, like whether it's an NPM package or a crate, ultimately it's a bunch of text files and a zip. So it's a very, from an infrastructure perspective, it's a very like common problem. But then these communities are coming together to talk about like, hey, what are problems that like PyPy has? What are problems that Crates has? What's happening in the NPM space? And especially around this, I think what every ecosystem right now is experiencing, even the established ones, is an increase in their bandwidth. And a lot of this has to do with kind of the emergence of AI. PyPy publishes like their charts, I think like annually or so for the download rates. And it's quite interesting because like Python is like a 26, 27-year-old language or so. And you had like a very like consistent growth. Yeah. It was a little bit like exponential, like not fully linear, but it went up a little bit steeper every year. But it was totally manageable until I think like a year or two ago, like you see like a massive just like hockey stick emerge, because people figured out that like PyPy is actually a really great distribution system for like their LLMs.
Right.
Because it doesn't have like it didn't have file size limits at the time, so you could just like put your like precompiled, GPU models just on there and like ship them. And this, I think, is like a common occurrence everywhere. So this has kind of, I think, sparked like a little bit of like a new like era for like all of the packaging ecosystems to come together and talk about like, hey, how do we actually, in a time where like open source is underfunded and traffic needs are growing, how can we actually like act together to try to find solutions to these like common problems? And yeah, I think it's a conversation that's kind of being started. It's also one that like, again, more the Crates.io side is participating in, but it's interesting to see how I think we as an industry share very, very common problems across all of the different ecosystems, be that Python, NPM, or Rust.
Yeah, and I think with a community that's maybe smaller, more hobbyist focused, you can have very, very relaxed rules about what goes into your package manager, and just, well, everyone knows the spirit of what we're trying to do here, and maybe you have to pull a couple people aside and say, tisk, tisk, but can get away without a lot of hard rules and consequences. And is that something that the Rust world is going to have to start to think about having, maybe much more hard and fast rules about sizes of packaging or the files that you're allowed to put into it, or how you're allowed to distribute?
So funnily enough, we are actually coming at this from the other angle, where we've always had compared to other ecosystems, very hard limits in place. So a crate can at max be like 10 megabytes in size. It's very limited like what kind of files you can put in there, which has helped us, ironically, like in this period, to actually maintain really healthy traffic. But I think there is a valid argument to be had whether or not this is actually serving all of the different use cases that Rust has. Because I think there are cases where you might actually want to put something precompiled like into your crate, because it's either difficult to compile locally, or like it takes an hour and a half to do, or you need to get the weirdest header files from somewhere else that like no one has. So I think I don't think like we've reached like the end state of like what Crates.io, of like what the Crates package format looks like. And that does have like interesting security implications. Where, for example, if we talk about like precompiled binaries or payloads, I think we all like have a little, as developers, every time we see a curl command that you're supposed to like pipe into your terminal, like I think every one of us goes a little like, can I trust this?
Yeah.
And I think the same is true if you're like now downloading a crate that has something precompiled in it that is not a text file, that you cannot inspect and see like, does this do anything or not? And this is where I would again this is an area where the Rust Foundation is like very actively kind of doing a lot of work and a lot of research. My colleague Adam, who's working on the Crates.io team, he's doing a lot of like work behind the scenes right now to find answers to some of these questions and try to figure out like what kind of like security testing, for example, can we do before we publish crates to make sure that whatever is published is actually secure, doesn't contain malicious payloads, but also how do we like surface this information to, first of all, the person publishing this who might involuntarily like have included files that are just not allowed. But also as an ecosystem, like when you go to Crates.io, can you actually like judge how well maintained, how secure a crate is? And I think there's also a conversation that's happening like pretty broadly in the ecosystem right now.
Yeah.
And then again, luckily for us on the infrastructure side, we're more on like we're very like far down the chain of kind of this process, where ultimately we need to interface with whatever Crates.io, for example, like builds as their security scanning architecture or infrastructure. So luckily for us, like we don't need to do the security like research ourselves. We can kind of just follow a little bit the inputs and the feedback that we get. But there's definitely, I think, a lot that still needs to happen essentially. Like we're really, I think as awesome as Rust already is and as much as I love using it, I do think it's important to consider like we're still a super young ecosystem. I think Python, I would consider Python to be now like in a very like mature and stable state, but it's a 26, 27-year-old project. Rust is like 10 years old. Like, there's a lot for us to still learn and figure out.
Now, but is the Rust ecosystem running into problems earlier than other languages because we are excellently achieving the goal of being foundational software, and Rust is being used in these places that are maybe even more security critical than other languages, and you have to hit all of these hard problems, earlier than maybe the Python world did?
I think that's definitely true. I think this is definitely, I think other ecosystems probably had a lot more time to mature and have more time to answer those questions. I think we are operating on a somewhat condensed timeline, and I also think there's just more stuff happening maybe right now because, and this is largely a success of open source, like open source is just everywhere. But it also means you are in more places where security implications might be more important. So it's kind of, I think it comes with the success of open source, it comes with everything that's happening in the ecosystem at large and like the industry that we're in. But it does mean we have less time to figure out some things. Yeah. On the flip side, we also have less baggage. We have less technical debt. We have 15 years less of like stuff that has accumulated. And that I think allows us also to, in some areas actually, I think be on the forefront of like what people are trying to do with, for example, like a package ecosystem and trying to figure out how can we keep things secure? How do we, what does the infrastructure of like an open source project in the 21st century need to look like? How can we like support this? And I think there it's really important to, like what's very close to my heart there is really like calling out like the Rust Foundation as well as someone who's like very, very actively supporting all of this work, either through like hiring me and Marco to like work full-time on infrastructure, having like Walter and Adam do like work a lot on the security side, but also as an organization, I think this is a topic we discuss internally a lot, like all of like those supply chain considerations, how we can work with other ecosystems to kind of together learn and grow and like build essentially like a better like industry. That's something where I know that like colleagues behind the scenes are like constantly like working to open doors for us as like a very like young language in a way to kind of be part of those conversations and sit at the table with like all the other ecosystems and all the other players to like have a voice in those conversations and be able to like both learn from what others have learned before us, but also help shape the discussion of like or the conversation around where are we going, like what do we want to do, how can we, especially nowadays, like I think the sustainability is becoming like a big question, like how can we actually like fund the project long term? How can we make sure that it has both the resources, or like it has the resources both in terms of like human resources, people who can actually work on this? How can we make sure like developers and maintainers are able to like dedicate themselves to this project? But also just on a purely like financial side, like how can we make sure we have the sponsorships that we need? Like where does the budget come from to run the infrastructure?
Yeah.
And that's such an like, I honestly, like, I underappreciated how much of my work would go into just like relationship management and like looking at budgets to try to figure out if like the credits are enough or if they run out before we get new ones.
Yeah, I mean, famously, the open core business model is you give the thing that doesn't cost you anything away for free, the software, and you charge for the thing that scales with use, the service, and it's all free in the Rust world, which is excellent for adoption, but it just requires, I'm sure, a very creative perspective on the business side.
Yeah, and like, this is like, I think one of the things where you have like different extremes kind of pulling at each other. Like as an open source project, you want everyone to use it for free. You want to be free software. You want to have a great user experience. Like we could, for example, like when we talk about downloads, there are ways for us to have like much cheaper downloads. But that would mean that we probably only have like a single location geographically, and everyone would need to download from, let's say, like Europe, because that's where I'm at. But that would be like a service deterioration for like other people. Like it would suddenly become much more painful to download crates from, especially like Australia, because they're freaking far away. But for us, like we want to use some of these services that are expensive for us or that we can't easily run in our like basement, because it provides a better experience for the Rust user.
Yeah.
And there's a tension there where, on one side we want to do the best we can. On the other side, we also need to be aware of the fact that it does cost us money. And
yeah, I had been thinking of infrastructure as a binary. It either works or it doesn't. But you're right, it's a slider. You can kind of pick how much money do you want to spend and what quality of service do you get out of it. Are there new technologies coming either for the Rust infra team or just this packaging world in general to help with these security problems? Are there like code sandboxing technologies or kind of some high-level support coming?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are like trying to figure out answers to this problem and are working on various different approaches to this. I know that like internally we've talked a lot about like different ways, especially when we go back to Crater, which pulls in all of those crates to build them and like give you feedback from the Rust compiler. What this essentially means is like if anyone puts like malicious code into their crate, we will pull that down and we will build it.
You will run it.
And especially like with and this is a particular problem in like Rust with how build scripts work. They essentially allow you to do anything you like to a large extent. So for us, this means that like for Crater, for example, we have built our own kind of sandboxing framework to run every build in like an isolated container to kind of prevent any malicious code from like escaping the sandbox and like messing with our host systems. And in a similar way, this is a conversation that like we're having this pain in Crater, but if we could solve it in a way that it's not just exclusive to Crater, but also protects like a user's machine from the same kind of vulnerability, that would be great.
Yeah.
And I know that this is something where people from, especially like Walter on the foundation side, is like actively like working on this. I'm sure that there are conversations ongoing in like the cargo teams and the crates teams about some of those aspects as well. Because ultimately, like I think every team that deals with packages has like a different angle to look at the problem, and we all need to come together to solve it. But I know that there are like a lot of people kind of doing interesting work in this area to try to figure out a solution to the problem.
Yeah. Well, I hope help is coming.
I'm optimistic.
I mean, we have this exponential curve happening, with traffic and other stuff, and it seems like somewhere it's got to taper off.
We'll see. Like, again, Rust is a young language. I don't know when that growth will stop.
Yeah.
I think there's an argument to be made that it will continue for a long while as like adoption grows. Being here at a conference like this, at RustConf, it's super exciting to see how the type of companies have changed who comes here to talk about how they've adopted Rust. Like we've had a talk of like Rivian, how they use Rust in like their cars. We've heard from other car manufacturers that are exploring those. Like Rust is getting into more and more applications that I think a few years ago were not imaginable, or like it wasn't mature enough yet. And as this continues, I think we'll see another wave of growth that will just kind of sustain this like exponential growth that we currently have. because we're suddenly getting into places that we didn't get in before. And yeah, being here, it's amazing to see who's talking about Rust and like who's using it and in what use cases sometimes. Because there's sometimes you hear things where you're like, oh, I did not know that this was a thing that like Rust is going to space, these kind of things. So I'm very, very kind of optimistic about like the future of Rust in general. I think we're continuing to grow. I think with this increase in adoption, there will be a lot of like very interesting, I think for all of us, like lessons we can learn about like how to use Rust and what other people would come up with like crazy innovative ideas of like what to do with the language. But also with like, especially with like corporate adoption, I think we'll also get like a new wave and hopefully of like investment into the ecosystem, companies paying people to work full-time on various parts of Rust, whether that's in the ecosystem or on the language and in the project itself. So yeah, I'm very excited to see kind of what the next 10 years will look like, because I have no clue.
Yeah, it's the state of Rust right now does very much feel like the dog that caught the car now doesn't know what to do with it.
I think this is a good analogy where suddenly we're in a situation where we go like, oh, we haven't fully thought this through. Like, what
great.
do we actually
Everyone
do
wants
now?
to use Rust. What now?
What now?
Yeah.
Especially like again coming back a little bit to like the infrastructure. It's been really fascinating to see how every year kind of the challenges change. It's really not stable is not the right word, but like we're constantly running into like new growing pains where something that was not an issue a year ago suddenly becomes an issue because our growth keeps just going up and up and up, and we're constantly like rebuilding parts of our infrastructure to kind of go along with that growth. And I really don't see that stopping anytime soon, which makes me as someone who, if I like put on my like user hat and like just look at this from the user perspective, I'm super excited about.
Yeah, no, as a guy not on the infra team, this all sounds great.
Yeah, I think they're like, with the language in particular and like with the ecosystem growing at this rate, I think there are super interesting things coming down the pipeline that I don't even know what they are yet.
Yeah.
And with that, I think for the project, there are a lot of challenges that a lot of people talk about, whether it's here or at other venues where, there is a challenge for us, be it to finance kind of the infrastructure that we need, find maintainers and contributors, and like create a healthy space for people to work that doesn't burn them out at an increasingly high rate. So there's interesting challenges for us to solve as well. It's exciting, I think, to be here, and there's a lot of work to be done, which that's a great combination, I think.
Yeah, no. Well, thank you for all your work keeping those magic cargo commands I can pop into my terminal just happening in the background is terrific. I think if there's any maybe call to action from this interview, it is if you are a company using Rust, maybe think about throwing on some donations to keep the infra team working.
Yeah, we always love new Rust Foundation members. I think this is like especially if you're a company, like this is one of the best ways to kind of support the work that we do. It provides us with enough budget that we can either allocate towards people that can work full-time on the project, or it allows us to like fill gaps in our like infrastructure sponsorship where not everything we use we get for free.
Yeah.
And for some things we actually need to pay with money that needs to come from somewhere. And if you're not a company, we're always looking for people to kind of help out. The infra team has a lot of, especially like Rust bots and areas where people can actually contribute quite easily.
Mm-hmm. Kind of small scoped bots that you can wrap your head around and help out with.
And in particular, like with infra, it's a little bit difficult because like we can't give people access to like our cloud infrastructure. So there are areas where it's actually not possible to contribute as a volunteer because like, you can't get access to the production systems. But there's a lot of other work that can be done. And as every other team in a project, we're also always a little bit like short-staffed. So when if you're at these companies, conferences, come to me, come to Marco, talk to us. We have work to do.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for doing the work that keeps Rust running.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
Awesome.
Thanks
Thank you so much.